Sorry. And for those of you who have not filled out the pre-panel survey, please do so now. This helps us as the organization to know how you guys are doing and how we can improve. So if you can also please stay at the end for the post-panel survey, it will be greatly appreciated. The discussion will be for an hour or so, and it's starting right now. So if the panelists for today could go ahead and introduce themselves, that would be great. Whoever will want to start can go ahead.
I can go first. My name is Alexandra Hernandez. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. My research is in evolutionary biology and ecology. And I'm just excited to be here today and share with you all some of the things that I've learned along the way in applying for fellowships.
I guess I can go next. Hi, I'm Meaghan Mcgeary. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I work in cancer biology, and likewise, I am excited to sort of share things I've learned, tips people shared with me at one point, and pass those along. So nice to meet you all.
Hi, my name is Karsten Heeger. I'm a faculty in physics at Yale University. I do research in neutrino physics and dark matter. I'm an experimentalist, and as chair of the department, I've put together some programs, also supporting students to apply for fellowships. So happy to offer any advice and comments that I can.
Thank you so much, all you three, for being a part of our first workshop for the year. And so one of the compiled questions that some mentees have in regards to fellowship application preparation is, as a first-year graduate student, what's the most effective method for discovering fellowship opportunities? Can you answer that question, any of you?
Yes, when I was in my program, I felt like the first place always to go and check was looking at the graduate school website. They often will list fellowship opportunities on there. There are some that can be more specific to your field, and I think those, it's helpful talking to people that are in your department, talking to other graduate students and postdocs, and kind of finding out what's out there. I know that some big ones are the NSF GRFP, and if you're in the biomedical sciences, the NIH F31, or a couple of others. But yeah, I would start with like looking at the graduate school website as a good place, and then kind of seeing from there, talking to people in your field to get to the more specific ones.
I would add to that another good place to check, in addition to the places that Alexandra just mentioned, is often foundations that support your field. And that might include foundations that run conferences in your field. So a great place to look for is if there's a conference or a foundation sort of mechanism that supports your lab, or that you've heard of, or that people often go to those conferences within that particular area. Like, for example, the American Cancer Society would be one in my field. Look on their websites, and oftentimes they will list their funding opportunities, and then go through theirs and try to sort of list and try to figure out which ones you're eligible for. Because oftentimes there are excellent funding opportunities that can come through those kinds of places and societies and organizations.
Yeah, I would just add to it that I think it's very good to get also read from your PI and other graduate students in the program. So when you enter graduate school, especially as a first year, you may or may not know exactly what group you're working in. If you have a group that you're working with, that's terrific. I think the PI, this group, will be a first point of contact for a lot of questions. They can advise you what's common in their field, what the potential fellowships are. You may also want to ask higher year graduate students who have gone through this. I always find that this is actually the best source of information. They have the time, they sit down with you, they can walk you through the process, while a PI might tell you, well, look at this website and start drafting an application. Students and postdocs in the groups, they can actually really advise on the details and what it takes and all of this. And then depending on your program, you may also want to ask your graduate program coordinators or registrars. They are typically a terrific resource for information, especially if they've been in the job for multiple years. They know the department, they know the fields, and yeah, don't forget about them as a resource.
Awesome.
One more good practice to get into is paying attention to the people ahead of you in your programs, in your labs. If you note or notice that someone gets a fellowship that seems like it would be a good fit for you, put it on your calendar for like the following year to check your Google for that. Not all of those will necessarily fit you, but it sometimes is a good way to, you might see a news release or something from your university saying, this person ahead of you got this really cool fellowship. And then not only do you know that there's someone ahead of you in your program that can maybe help you down the line, but it also is a good reminder to then remember to look like maybe in 6 months for the funding announcement of that fellowship, or Google it right then and figure out when the next cycle would be, and then put it in your calendar to look it up when it comes out again. Because then you can stay on top of it. It's a good way to sort of stay aware of new things that are coming out or new fellowships that maybe people don't know about in your lab or in your program.
That's really a good advice. I do that as well. So the second question is, what steps should I take to initiate my fellowship proposal? So like, where do they start? Do they start with outreach? Do they start with their thesis proposal? All those sort of things.
I mean, I would say again that it's quite field or it could be field specific, and again it helps talking to other people. So one of the most common fellowship, of course, is the NSF graduate fellowships. Many people have gone through this. They have a pretty prescribed format. You have a couple of chances to apply for it, once as an undergrad and once as a graduate student. And then you have to think about the timing. When can you prepare the strongest possible proposal? It could be in your first year, but it could also be in your second year of graduate school, after you have worked with a research group, after you have found your footing and embedded yourself in the environment on campus. And so I would say, again, talk to fellow graduate students. Often, especially for NSF, there are university programs like teaching centers that offer workshops, how to prepare fellowship applications. So they also have good advice.
Yeah, I agree with like going to those workshops that they have or prepping your applications. Like those are super helpful that they provide at the university. And I would say that, like, yes, I agree, it's very specific to the fellowship or field interest. Usually, like, you should read the whole like solicitation or whatever it is that they're providing you that information. Like, read the whole thing through so you get an idea of like what exactly they're looking for in the application. You can even take that to your advisor and show them like, hey, this is what they're asking me for, and kind of work with your advisor to craft like what would be a strong point. Like, it would be important if it's a research focused application to come up with your research question, your hypothesis, and then kind of like frame from there. But working with your advisor along the way, and as Karsten said, working with other graduate students or postdocs in the lab will be very helpful in that process.
I think it's good to note that when you're thinking about, when you like from the point where you first see the notice, or you first see the sort of advertisement for everything, for the fellowship or whatever, and have all of that information that you're going to take to your PI and to your classmates and your registrar and your colleagues in your lab, it's also helpful to like work backwards, I think, from a deadline. So if you know what the deadline is for the grant, right, add a like 2-week buffer in there just from the get-go, and then work backwards in terms of what thinking about which pieces are going to be the most difficult, take the most time, want the most edits from your faculty member advisor or anyone who's reading it for you. And sort of start from there. It takes practice to get used to these things, but I think thinking about all of the different components and like where you're going to start, right? If you're writing, or if a research proposal serves as a huge chunk of that, then you're going to want to start with your specific aims, right? Maybe, or the outline of exactly what you're thinking through for what that research proposal is going to look like. And then eventually, right, that will feed into the body of the research proposal. You're not going to want to write your abstract right before you write all of that, because you don't know what's in it before. So, you're not necessarily going to want to work through the application in sort of a chronological order of how it's listed. But you're going to want to get that stuff done earlier, right? Because that's the stuff you're going to want to get advice on, as opposed to maybe some of the more personal documents like your personal statement that might be less something that you would hand. Maybe and that's great if you can and should hand it to your PI, but if this is going to go to someone else, that maybe that's a slightly different revision process, right? The other thing I think it's really important to be aware of on these grants is that many of them will go through your institution. So you're going to submit them to the institution or your fellowships office or your registrar, and then those places will submit them on your behalf. And those things are not instant. I learned this the hard way. These things can take time. And so as soon as you can, you should check in. As soon as you know you're going to apply for a grant, the first thing you should do is A, ask for letters of recommendation well ahead of the deadline. And B, look for your grants office or your fellowships office and ask around and figure out where that is and find out what their deadlines are for your grant to make it to the right place at the right time. Because sometimes those can be as few as 1 day, business day ahead of time, and those can be as many as 10. So you want to know that, right? That your real deadline is to get it to that office 10 days ahead of the fellowship deadline, not to get it to the grant agency at the deadline. And that is where you should then work back from, because you don't want to find out that, you finish the grant and you think you're making the deadline for the agency, and then find out that your institution wants it 5 days earlier, and then you're already missing that. It gets really scary in there, and that's the last thing you want to deal with at that stressful time of submitting. So work well ahead of your deadlines and work backwards, and make sure you've asked your registrar or your fellowship how it works at your institution in terms of what it's going to take to submit the fellowship on time.
Great. So the next question is, what can I include in the opening lines to make it compelling and competitive? So what's a good hookup sentence, or what makes that individual stand out, or what can they do to stand out?
Well, let me say a couple of things. As someone who has reviewed a fair number of proposals for various fellowships and also other proposals, I mean, you have to remember that the reviewers will be reviewing a number of proposals. So basically, they get a bunch of PDFs or maybe printouts of the statements, and you want to make it as easy as possible for someone to find the information and get the objective of what you're trying to do, what you're proposing to do, and how you want to do it. So for me, what is always very important is you have a well-formatted proposal. It's proofread, no errors. I can easily find objectives, or in the case of NSF proposals, intellectual merit, broader impact. So that gives me a chance to scan, let's say, a 2-page fellowship proposal and quickly get a sense of what it's about. So it's not necessarily the words of the first sentence, but the way it's laid out, where I can find the information. And yeah, if I can just by skimming it actually get a sense of what the proposal is about. And then I would also make sure that the first opening paragraph is exciting, and it hooks people in, why you want to do something, and why you're the right person to do this, and what you're planning to do. If you go first through a lot of background and introduction, then you might lose the reader.
I think you can think of your opening section as a little bit of a sort of, I think someone taught me to think about it as a pyramid, where the very top is where you're starting. And so you're going to start with a very general thing, sort of introducing your audience, right, to your reviewers, to your problem. And then you're going to build your problem out from there and into the more technical aspects of details of how you're going to do your experiments and how you're going to fix that problem. But you want to start with something that's going to attract a broad enough view that it will get all of the possible reviewers, right? Because the reviewers, if you're thinking about, let's start with like the most narrow, like a foundation that's specific into the disease or area that you're working on, right? That's going to be the most probably narrow possible audience, right? And then you could be applying to something like that NSF fellowship that could be a very, very broad audience, right? That will not be completely in your field. So you want to make sure that you're attracting the people that are outside your field and don't know why your research is exciting with something that will make sense to them at that very first sentence. You don't want to lose them in the early parts, right? So frame your problem sort of generally for a scientific audience in a way that you could imagine communicating it to most sort of scientists in your area, in your broad area, right? That if you say the sentence to any of those people, they would say, oh yes, of course, that is a problem and that makes sense. And then go from there and continue making sure that your audience, whoever that is, whoever you're envisioning as you're writing your fellowship, is going to understand each point as you're explaining it and going through. But again, making sure that you frame it very generally in terms of a problem that you are going to fix or understand better.
I thought that was like a great description of starting broad and going in narrow. Yeah, I feel like whenever I've written proposals, like I try to, in the first paragraph, make it clear what the problem is and why it's important to study it. What are the impacts? Because like the rest of my panelists said, like you don't want to lose the reviewers from the get-go. And I would also add, like, it depends also, like, if you're doing a personal statement, that's going to be different than if you're doing a research statement. So for a personal statement, I often use that first paragraph, like, I'm telling people my background, but I'll start it by, like, telling them, like, the important pieces of my background, like the things that I'm passionate about and why I want to be an academic, why I want to do the research that I'm doing. So for me, like my cultural background is very important and it has taught me a lot of resilience. And I like make sure to like include that in there. So I feel like whatever you're comfortable in sharing your story of like who you are, because it's hard to put who you are in just like a chunk of like paragraphs or paper. Like we're so complex, we have such like unique stories. So just being able to put some of that in there, I think can make it compelling.
Great. Okay, so the next question is, when should one begin the preparation process for writing fellowship applications, and how can you use previous submissions when starting a new application?
I think this is another one that's going to be very field and lab specific. And I think like others have said, it sort of depends on when you feel like your research is at a point to start sort of putting something together, but also sort of taking into account what different fellowships expect. So depending on the fellowship, they'll expect more or less preliminary data. They'll expect more or less of a personal statement or progress on your research already. And they'll have different requirements for what year you have to be, how far along in your research you can be or have to be, how many years you'll get out of the fellowship before you move on to your next thing. And so all of these need to be sort of taken into account. And I think it's hard to sort of, I think from day one, right, in your lab or in your graduate program, you can start having these things on your radar and start asking these questions as to like when most people in the program apply for the NSF or when most people apply for the NIH. And that will depend on the lab. It'll also depend on the project you're walking into. If you're walking into a project that has a lot of, you know, that you're following up on a new area or you're starting a whole new thing, whether you're going to be ready to put that together into a research proposal or not. So I think from day one, you know, you can start asking these questions and have patience, right? And remember that some of them you're not going to be quite ready for. But also, you know, as soon as you feel like you have met the requirements for preliminary data, just go for it, right? Start putting together an outline and show it to your PI or your colleagues and say, do you think this is enough? Do you think this is going to be ready, or should I wait another 6-12 months to have this data point before I'm ready to put the fellowship in?
I'll also add that sometimes you never feel ready, because I feel like I've also been through that too. I'm like, no, maybe I'll just wait. And then my PI will talk to me and be like, that happens to all of us. Like, I think you should try. And, we'll like put this plan together and be like, okay, I'm going to try. And if I don't make it, it's okay. I'll have made a lot of progress and we can develop it further for the next deadline. But I think it's okay to start early. Like, if you see a deadline, you can start early, start that plan, and make that outline, start writing and seeing how far you get, but also having the grace of like, if I don't make it, it's okay, I'll make the next one. Although I know that there are some deadlines that there aren't really a next one, like the GRFP. So if you're in your second year, so if that's the case, I would just say start as early as you can for that. But yeah, have grace on yourself and just give it a shot.
Thank you for that. So the next question is, what is your recommendation for crafting an exceptional research proposal that effectively conveys the project's impact in a clear manner? So I know that the NIH and the NSF are very different grants, but for example, if you want to go more general, which is in terms of the NSF, how can you convey that message in a scientific manner that anyone could understand it? So I know that comes with practice, but do you guys have any suggestions for this?
Yeah, I would just first of all say, try to think about writing this for an undergraduate or maybe at the colloquium level. Don't write it for your research group. So there's a tendency to include a lot of jargon, a lot of details that are really just specific to your research field. But again, reviewers that might read your application, they come from all areas of physics. I mean, it's very rare that I actually get necessarily a fellowship proposal that's in my specific area. So I think if you aim for talking to perhaps an undergraduate, advanced undergraduate, someone who has a physics background, but doesn't know much about the field, that would be the level I would recommend writing for.
So going to that, Dr. Heeger, do you have any examples of what to do and what not to do in these proposals? Like an example sentence for everyone to understand.
So if, let me see, if, so for example, my research is about studying neutrinos, neutrino mass, neutrino properties. They're important for the evolution of the universe. And I want to find out in my research if neutrinos are their own antiparticles. So for that, we're using a rare nuclear decay that has never been observed. And if we see it, we can prove that neutrinos are their own antiparticles. That would be a new discovery. So I think this is a statement that probably everyone can understand. And you can also frame this in terms of, yeah, much more jargon, where it then becomes very difficult to follow. So if you write your research proposal with lots of acronyms and jargons, I also always say try to minimize the number of acronyms if you need to use them at all, because no one wants to look up what XRFS is and all of this. And if I don't get this by reading through the proposal, then it's difficult to follow.
I want to highlight a couple of things I think that came out of that example statement that are really helpful to try to flag for yourself. I think the first is that problem, right, that we've been talking about, framing your research in terms of a single problem that you're going to try to solve through your research proposal. The second, I think, is that was really great is that Dr. Heeger highlighted novelty. So noted that if we find this, this would be a new discovery, right? That kind of thing highlights for your readers what it is that would be cool and interesting and new about any discovery that you're going to make in your paper. And so you can use these kinds of words and these kinds of statements in your different parts of your proposal to highlight what would be new, what would be impactful, and say things like this would be impactful because this would lead to a cure, because this discovery would help us understand this fundamental aspect of the universe in a way that hasn't been done before. And those kinds of things, right, are gonna, it's very simple statements and are gonna help highlight what it is about your research that's different and interesting and new. And so using those kinds of phrases, try to highlight those things. And the other thing you can even do, depending on the requirements of your fellowship, and always make sure these things are okay, but use things like italics and bold, right? Try to pull out the very specific and very most critical pieces so that when your reader who's read 50 fellowships that day, right, is looking at your proposal, these aspects, these novelty and how you're going to solve this problem and how you're going to, what it is about your research that is different and better than every other fellowship they're going to read jumps out immediately, right, from that paper at 10 o'clock at night, right, when your fellowship, your reviewer is reading the thing the day before it's due. So think about those kinds of techniques and strategies to try to highlight those aspects in your work.
I think you can also ask like fellow graduate students or postdocs, people inside of your department that aren't studying exactly what you're studying, to review your proposal. That way you get a perspective from other people that aren't like looking at the same thing you are all the time, and they can kind of help you figure out like, is your story clear? Is the impact clear? That kind of thing. It could be something that you even talk about it at a seminar or something you go through, or you have like a joint lab meeting, let's say, and you invite others to come and give feedback. Those kind of things can help figure out how clear that the impact is, how clear the project idea is to people outside of your lab.
Great advice, thank you. So the next question is, what specific factors or standards do selection committees typically consider during their evaluation process? I know this is a broad question and it depends on what fellowship you're applying, but if you can give some examples for both NIH and NSF, that would be great.
Again, perhaps speaking in general terms, I think you want to articulate what you're doing, what gap you're bridging with your work. Where's the need for this research? I mean, you want something that is not just an incremental, perhaps additional measurement on something existing, but try to convey to the reviewers what would not get done if your proposal is not funded. So think in terms of the reverse. What would they lose if they didn't fund you or if they didn't fund your proposal? And then also make the case, well, you are the best person to carry this out. There are lots of proposals, there are lots of people out there, and that might be a moment to bring in your experience, your lived experiences, what you can bring to the task, whether it's through broader impacts at the NSF or through research experience. So it can take several different dimensions there.
I think speaking more broadly about fellowship, like outside, like thinking about like foundation fellowships or that kind of thing, right? They're all going to be a little different in terms of what they're looking for. And sometimes they're research fellowships, right, where they're funding a project. Sometimes they're more fellowship where they're funding the person, right? Part of the NSF and the NIH, right, is that they're funding trainees who are going to become the next generation of scientists and researchers and brilliant minds that are going to fix all of our world's problems, right? And so part of what they're funding is your education and your training. You want to make sure that you're honing properly into exactly what those fellowships are looking for, right? Because they're all going to be blends of looking for excellent research and excellent training programs. The NIH is, has very specific just lost the light. Anyways, that NIH has very specific documents and things that are designed to highlight each of those pieces, so that you can highlight what aspects of your training, what you're going to learn through various aspects of your training, and how that's going to make you a better scientist. So you want to pay attention to those kinds of things as well, and make sure that you're accounting for and also sort of including all of those aspects and what it is that you're building, right, as you as a scientist through your training, whether that's bioinformatics skills or other kinds of technical skills, right? Or a specific technique or method that you are going to be one of, 5 in the world or 1 in the world that knows how to do, right? Or those kinds of things alongside, and how that bridges, right, into your research, how your research is going to feed you as a trainee, and how your training and the work you're doing is going to feed the research field. And you can hopefully put that all together, the more time you give yourself, into a complete package in your fellowship application. But always paying attention to what exactly these fellowships are seeking to fund. They should all have a paragraph or so or more describing what the purpose of the fellowship is, right? And so you're going to want to pay attention to all of those things so that you include that in your research application, right? Touching on all of the various requirements and aspects of the thing that they're looking for.
Awesome. Another of the questions here are, what specific criteria do selection committees typically use when evaluating fellowship applications? So does the research that they're proposing go hand in hand with the tools and techniques used in the lab, or what, as I reiterate from previous questions, what makes that person stand out? What are the reviewers looking for in that person?
Yeah, it's it's hard to answer this in general terms, but again, I would just go back to asking yourself the question, and this may be a very hard question initially. Why are you the person, to do this, and what's unique about this? I think more and more for fellowship applications, people are considering essentially the full package. It's not just the research, it's not just what you do in outreach, but it's all of this combined. And so even though it may be daunting and you might think, well, how can I compete in research with people who have maybe more research experience or prior research experience, but you are bringing something unique to this task, and that is yourself. And think about what it is that your experience can add to this. I mean, with a fellowship, people are typically not funding the research, they're funding you, and they want you to succeed. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
I think a couple other key components are going to include feasibility. So, I think this is a big one, or at least this was what I was taught as a big one, is the research you're proposing going to be feasible for you to complete in the amount of time that you're proposing it in, right? And given the resources that you have available to you in your lab, in your institution. And you want to make that explicitly clear that it is feasible and that you have every intention of doing every aspect of it. And there's ways you can prove that, right? So you can talk about the work, the way that your lab's done this method before, or your lab developed this method, or you work with the person that developed this method or does it really well. And here's some data to prove that we've done this before and this is how it works. You can mention the resources at your institution or at an institution you might visit or be in contact with or collaborate with, right? So, you have cancer biology, right? So like we have a bioinformatics facility that helps us do the sequencing and do the analysis. And they will work directly with me to make sure that that analysis happens well. Or if it includes a specific sort of developing a new thing, like who are the collaborators and people that are going to work with you to get that to happen, and why are they the experts that make you and this sort of circle of little area of the world, right, the place where that needs to happen. And so including all of that, so that when the person who's reading your fellowship application goes through and reads it, they say, of course, this person is the person. They have all of the tools and tasks and resources they need, and they are ready to go. This sounds great. All, you know, all power to you, check off, funded, right? You don't want them to be like, well, I think they can do it, but I'm not sure. It doesn't say anything about their coding ability, and it doesn't say anything about anyone that might help them. It's okay to write, like, depending on the fellowship, right? It's okay to write, I'm taking this class and I'm learning how to code or sequence or whatever it is in your field, right? I'm taking this thing and I'm working with this expert and I'm figuring it out. And that's part of the fellowship, right? That's part of that big picture. But feasibility is a big one, because you don't want someone to get through the thing and say, how on earth are they gonna figure all of this stuff out? It doesn't look like they have any of this in their background. So just write it, right? Give it to them, show them exactly how it works, how you're gonna do it, and how you're gonna learn it. And that's a part of your training, part of what they're funding.
Yeah, and I would add to that you can, like, if you're transitioning, like maybe you did research in one area before and now you're kind of transitioning into a different area, you can highlight some of the things that you did before and how it, like the skills that you learned there, because you still learned a lot of skills for your field, how those will translate to the new projects that you're doing. And pairing that with what Meaghan said about like showing that you are working with collaborators to help you build the new skills, and that you are going to take classes for that, like all of those things combined will set you up for like a successful scientific career in whatever project you're proposing to do.
Thank you, Alexandra. So the next question is, are there any particular pieces of information that applicants can expect to be requested during the application process? So I am inferring that as, do you need preliminary data? Do you need some publications to back up your proposed thesis work? And so forth.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is going to be very fellowship specific. I think in terms of the like technical pieces, this comes back to like the work very far ahead of the deadline and go through the whole packet at the very beginning, right? The NIH F31 has a very long and specific list of the components that you need that range from your personal statement all the way through to a list of equipment in your lab. Some of those you'll be able to get help, right, from your lab manager, your lab mates. And some of those, you know, maybe that means you take a clipboard, you walk around and you write down PCR machine, incubator, right? Like all these things. So they'll all have very different requirements. Some of them are really simple, right? Some of them will just require a personal statement, specific aims, and your name and address or your email. And some of them have much more exhaustive requirements. So just pay attention to the requirements in the thing. Some of them will have a second step as well. So like, for example, with the NIH grant, oftentimes they'll have a second round of sort of review. They'll email you for more information. And that might include information about your animal protocol or specific safety measures that your lab takes to deal with a hazardous material. Or it might, again, repeat collection of your name and address. Sometimes these things are a little redundant, but you're communicating with different levels of organizations and things. So just be patient with some of that. But it's good to talk to people that have applied ahead of time to these grants before you to get a sense of what that's going to look like, because it's really going to depend on your fields and the grant and the fellowship that you're applying for. And it's a little hard to predict exactly what that will entail without sort of knowing. And requirements change, right? The NIH is constantly updating their sort of requirements and aspects of documentation that they require at various stages. And so just stay on top of your emails, stay on top of those funding websites and things to make sure you're including the most recent version of all of those requirements.
I agree. Dr. Heeger, you mentioned before that, for example, the NSF looks to fund you as a person and not your research per se. One question in the chat was, is there one component of the application more important than the other? So for example, the personal statement versus the research statement, and inside there, what's more important, the intellectual merit or the broader impacts, or are they weighted equally?
Yeah, so I think what is important, there are several components, as you pointed out, to an application. And in the end, you want to convey a story that's consistent. And I think gives an overall picture of you as a person, your interests, your ambitions, your aspirations, and how it fits into the proposed research. As it was mentioned earlier, I think by Meaghan and others, feasibility for the research part is really important. You want to make sure you're not proposing something that's clearly not plausible. So I mean, that shows that you've done your homework, that you've talked to other group members, PIs, and so on. The personal statements, an opportunity for you to make the case what you as a person bring to this enterprise and what your interests are, what excites you. And so they all have they all play into it. In the end, basically there's a rubric that you get as part of the NSF process, and you give some numerical marks on each one of these sections. But I think the most important thing is that there's a whole package that hangs together. And even if you don't know exactly what you want to do with your graduate education or PhD, that is okay too. But you can talk about the skills that you want to develop and why it interests you and what the potential options are that you're considering after a PhD, for example.
I wanted to let everybody know that the rubric and the feedback that you get from the NSF, we have a GSEC website that has examples from past participants that could help you guys understand what the reviewers are looking for, and keep an eye out on the specific terminology and the wording that they use as well. So if you guys would like, I can provide that information later on. But yes, so we have one more question. If Meaghan and Alexandra don't have anything to add from this previous one. And it's, while it can be challenging for international students to find fellowships, can you suggest some valuable resources to assist them in their search?
This is tricky, and I think it's changing rapidly, hopefully in a good direction, to help have more funding opportunities for international students. I think it goes along with sort of a first, finding fellowships in general. I think many times foundations will have opportunities that maybe are less stringent in terms of the people that are applying, and are more open to sort of anyone that's doing that kind of research. And I think, things like just Googling, right, incessantly. I've done it. You can spend a whole afternoon doing it, right? Like just Googling, looking for fellowships in your field, and just looking through the requirements, and trying to find everything that you can. And hopefully the pool is going to increase over time, to create more opportunities for people. That's sort of the answer I have for that. But I do think foundations are often a good place to check.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too, because I've known students that have asked similar questions and have had this struggle. One thing that I was thinking about is my institution, it has this, it's called Pivot. You can, if your institution has it, you can go in and put in like keywords of what you're looking for, and they'll just populate all of the fellowships that relate to whatever field you're in. And those would include foundations, as Meaghan said, or like just fellowships across the board. So they will have stuff that doesn't have those stringent requirements in there. And I'm also going to post a link that my institution has provided that has, it's specifically for those in the science field. It says Pathways to Science, and it has fellowships in there that are for non-US citizens. So I think that that could be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. I think that is it for this panel. I thank you, Alexandra, Karsten, Meaghan, for taking the time to meet with us and give us advice for our mentees. And
I wanted to share one last bit of advice, actually. This is a fun one that was given to me by someone when my first fellowship, which I was not funded, by the way. So important to note that all of us have had fellowships that weren't funded, and you just got to keep moving. It's sad and upsetting and frustrating, but just keep rolling and something will hit. But the advice that was given to me is along these lines when I first applied for my first NSF years ago. And it was that when you submit the fellowship, that is the first moment that you should celebrate. So submit the grant, you submit the thing. The person that told me this, her tradition was going out for sushi. I personally have warped that for myself into going out for pizza because that is my favorite food. But you should always celebrate just the process, having gotten through the process of submitting the fellowship or the grant, and give yourself a pat on the back for making that happen. And then when you get it, you get to celebrate again. But always recognize that that is a big and worth celebrating moment for yourself, so that you can keep that positivity sort of rolling through the process as well.
thank you so much. Okay, as all the panelists, if you have somewhere to be, you are free to go whenever. I just need everyone that joined in, apart from the panelists, to please fill out the post-panel survey. And I'll see you guys in the next workshop. Thank you, everyone.